Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about the abolition movement or the effort to end slavery in antebellum America. So I want to start off first by looking at some of the different attempts to end slavery on some levels before we get to some famous abolitionists. So in 1808, the international slave trade was banned. If you think back to the Constitutional Convention, one of the compromises made there was called the Slave Trade Compromise, which basically said that Congress wasn't allowed to touch the international slave trade for 20 years. Well, in 1808, the 20 years is up, and Congress decides to officially ban or stop the importation of enslaved people from Africa. Now, this is obviously a step in the right direction when it comes to ending slavery. However, slavery could still exist in the United States even without new enslaved people coming in from Africa. So after 1808, new slaves in America were actually born into slavery rather than being imported. Now, this ban on the slavery trade or the slave trade is upheld in a U.S. Supreme Court case called U.S. v. Amistad. The Amistad is the name of a ship that was originally Spanish. It was taking enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean. However, the kidnapped people on board. They rebelled and they took control of the ship, killed the Spanish crew, and the ship floated into New York Harbor in the late 1830s. So now the US faces a dilemma. Do they send the enslaved people back to Africa? Do they keep them in the US as slaves, or do they keep them in the US as free people, or do they give them back to Spain? And in the end, the Supreme Court decided to send them back to Africa, send them back to their homelands, which was definitely a show of good faith by the US government to uphold the ban on new slaves from Africa. There was also a group of people more in like the early 1800s who believed that slavery was wrong, but the races could not coexist together. So emancipation or freeing slaves wouldn't really work unless those freed people went back to Africa. So there was this recolonization movement that was supported by people like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay and James Monroe, which basically believed that the best course of action for freed people was to return to Africa. So slave owners who agreed to this program would free their slaves on the condition that they were sent to the African continent, specifically to a colony known as Liberia. Liberia is today a country. The capital is Monrovia, named after James Monroe when this program was started, and their flag looks a lot like the American flag. Um, Keep in mind, though, a lot of these freed people had never been to Africa, like they were not from Africa. Or if they had been from Africa, they definitely weren't from this part. So even though they were returned to Africa, they're in a place that is completely unfamiliar to them. And there's also people already living in this area of Africa as well. And so actually what ended up happening is these newly freed people that were sent back to Africa actually started their own system of slavery where they enslaved the native people. But if you think about it, like this is all these people ever knew. Like a lot of them were born and raised in slavery. And so they thought this is how you make money, this is how a society operates. But in the end, Liberia had years and years and years of civil wars and civil unrest until it's really found stability in the last few decades recently. So we're not going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about, European or American influence in Africa and the instability that that has caused in that continent. But this was definitely an element of disruption in the African continent when America started to recolonize Liberia. Another route to ending slavery was to try to slow its expansion. So, as Americans are moving out west, there was lots of debate on whether or not slavery should also go out west. And so, there were some compromises to try to resolve some of these debates. In the end, these compromises on slavery's expansion were just temporary measures. None of them actually work. We know that because eventually we do have the Civil War, which is largely fought over slavery and its expansion. So they were really just kind of like band-aids on the larger problem of slavery and its expansion. Two examples here would be the Missouri Compromise that we've already talked about. And then in a few objectives, we'll talk about the Compromise of 1850. But again, both of these just try to address the debate over the expansion of slavery into the West. And then lastly, there are some people in the US who wanted complete abolition, just banning slavery outright. And in the northern states, this was the case. Slavery definitely was banned in those northern states or any states that were added as free states. However, it's important to recognize, though, even in areas that did not have slavery, um, lives for Black Americans in those areas were definitely, it wasn't safe. There was a lot of discrimination, legal and societal. There was segregation, there was racial violence. And so, even with the end of slavery that eventually comes, discrimination is definitely something that's going to be an issue. And the problems stemming from the 19th century that were never really resolved when it comes to race bled into the 20th century and then bled into the 21st century. So a lot of the racial issues that we see today come from this racial history of the past. Okay, so let's talk about how slaves were able to resist in their everyday lives. One way would be to participate in a rebellion or a revolt. This is something that was done with Nat Turner's rebellion. It was the most famous rebellion at the time. So Nat Turner was a preacher in Virginia, and he was able to, with this position as a preacher, to travel between plantations. And so he used this mobility to form a following of other slaves who agreed with him. And in 1831, he and his rebels, for several weeks, I think it was during the summer of 1831, they attacked various plantations and they ended up killing about 60 white slave owners during this time. Eventually, Nat Turner and some of his conspirators were captured, they were hanged, and in the end, what we see really come out of Nat Turner's rebellion and other rebellions of the time period is that instead of slave owners being like, hey, slavery is clearly a problem and the slaves are very unhappy with it, let's, maybe end slavery, is that a lot of slave owners reacted in the opposite way and thought, okay, restrictions need to be worsened and slaves need to be treated worse and they needed to be watched more closely and there need to be limitations on how much they can learn to read and write and gather and all of these things. So Virginia and other states passed new slave codes, which basically increased restrictions on enslaved people in those areas. Still, though, there were small little ways that slaves could find to resist in their everyday lives, just working on their plantations. For example, they could work slowly to slow down production, or break equipment, or neglect animals, or break fences so the animals could get out, or not harvest the crops, or things like that, just to find these little ways that they could individually have some agency or control over their situation. Another way that slaves found to resist was to escape, and the most popular system of routes at the time was known as the Underground Railroad. Now, I know on my image it is misspelled, it should have an I right here for railroad, but essentially, underground here just means secret or hidden, and railroad does not mean like an actual train railroad. Really, it's just referring to a mode of transportation. So these secret routes were often by foot or water or in the back of carriages or things like that, where slaves would travel mostly at nighttime, usually with the help of a conductor. Now, conductors are just people who helped slaves escape. They could offer things like shelter or food or transportation or guidance or things like that. These were white and black people in the North and the South, and often, I mean, this required, putting their lives in danger because there were patrols out looking for escaped slaves and the people who were helping them. So it was very dangerous to participate in the Underground Railroad. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. She was a former slave herself. She ended up escaping slavery and then raised enough money to buy her parents out of slavery. But that wasn't enough for her. She went back multiple times into the South to secretly help over 300 slaves escape to freedom. She is often known as the Moses of her people, this idea that she is leading her people out of bondage or out of slavery. There was a movie that was recently made about her. If you want to go watch the trailer, go for it. The link is right there. I do want to talk about some important abolitionists or people who fought to end slavery before we end the notes today. It's important to recognize that even though these people all have the same goal, which is ending slavery, it doesn't mean that they all agree on the right way to get there, right? They all believe in these different routes that would be the most effective way that they think is to actually end slavery. This is really evident in the first two people we see here, Garrison and Douglas. They were actually friends and they worked together at first, but they realized that they had different beliefs on how to actually end slavery. So they kind of split ways and formed their own newspapers to circulate their beliefs. Okay, so Garrison, he's right here. He was known as a radical abolitionist. Basically, what that means is that his opinions and ideas were kind of out of the mainstream abolitionist way of thought. He believed that there should be immediate, overnight emancipation of slaves, and then slave owners should receive no payment from the government. Um, Again, this was radical because it was, very, very quick. It wouldn't be a gradual thing, which is what a lot of slave owners wanted, even if they were willing to give up their slaves. But he was able to circulate his ideas in his newspaper called The Liberator. So, like I said, Frederick Douglass was one of his kind of colleagues or friends in the abolition movement until Frederick Douglass kind of broke away because he had different beliefs from Garrison. Douglass himself was a former slave. He was able to escape because he knew how to read and write. So he used those tools to eventually escape. I think it was from Maryland to Boston, I believe. But anyway, once he obtained his freedom, he became a skilled speaker and writer against slavery, and eventually he became pretty close with Abraham Lincoln and was one of Lincoln's top advisors before and during the Civil War on race related issues. Okay, Douglas's beliefs about the end of slavery were that violence was not an option, and like fighting physically back was just going to prolong abolition. He believed that there should be legal means of change. Basically, laws needed to be passed, court cases needed to be won to build up like the actual framework for abolition on paper. That way, it'd be harder to put slaves back into slavery if that ever happened. So he wanted a political means of emancipation, not a violent means of emancipation. And he circulated his ideas in the North Star newspaper. A few female abolitionists to mention here. It's important to recognize this last point real quick here. Now it's covered up, but many women who were active in reform movements, not just abolition, but many women who stepped outside the home and made their voice publicly known in society were discriminated against by men. There were many men at the time who believed that women should not be leaving the house. It was not their place to be talking about these things in public. And so the abolition movement is definitely a great example of this. There were some anti slavery societies that women weren't even allowed to join because they were seen as not supposed to be out of the house. So a lot of women would form their own abolition societies because they weren't allowed to join the men. So they were like, cool, I'll just make my own. So you see this discrimination in other reform movements as fuel to have women fight for more of their own rights later on. So a lot of female abolitionists are actually also women's rights activists. And Sojourner Truth and the Grimke sisters are great examples of that. We'll start with Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave as well. She Her name at birth was Isabella Baumfree, but it was changed after she got her freedom to Sojourner Truth. The word sojourn means to travel, and so her name literally means traveling truth, which is what she did. She traveled around the northern states, speaking out about women's rights and about abolition. Her most famous speech is called Ain't I a Woman, where she basically is talking about how the experiences of Black women are very different than the experiences of white women. And many white women who are fighting for women's rights were really only fighting for white women's rights. And so she's saying there's this whole other group of people, enslaved women, Black women, even if they're free, who have different experiences and experience different discrimination, and their experiences need to be held um, and or need to be of concern and or important to the women's rights movement as well. Two other female abolitionists and women's rights activists are the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They're pretty interesting because they're actually from South Carolina, and their family owned slaves. And they were very inspired by the Second Great Awakening, and they believed that slavery was a sin and that white owners of slaves would go to hell. So they were really concerned about the salvation of their family members. However, after more discussion with other abolitionists, they also came around to the belief that slavery was also bad for the slaves as well, and that it should be ended for their sake, not just the fate of their white masters. So I have two good videos here that you can go watch in the notes. This is Ain't I a Woman's Speech read by Kerry Washington. It's pretty good. And then here's the video of just a reenactment of some of the Grimke sisters and what it must have been like for them to live literally on a plantation with slaves but be abolitionists.